This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want to pre-order some Duskmourn cards, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and in this video I'm continuing with my Duskmourn Limited set review. Over the last several days, I've been evaluating every single card in the format to get you ready for your pre-release and the release of the set on Magic Arena. So far, I've covered every card in the set except the mono green ones, and in this video, we'll be looking at those green cards. For each of these cards, I'll discuss how I think they'll perform in Limited, that means draft and sealed, and I'll punctuate each evaluation with a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews and unsure of what my letter grades mean, you can find a guide in the description of this video. There are a few important things to keep in mind as I review these cards. First, because we're only talking about draft and sealed, I'm only going to be talking about cards that can be found in play boosters. Furthermore, I'm only looking at cards from the main set in this video, not at special guests. These are also my evaluations of these cards before playing with them, since the goal is to have my set review done in time for the pre-release, and that of course means I'll be wrong about some stuff, but as the format comes into focus, I'll be doing videos where I discuss how things have panned out. Also, I want to let you know that there are some set review related perks for being a channel member or a patron. You get access to my ongoing set notes during preview season, and you also get a spreadsheet with all of my grades once the set review is complete, which is today. If those perks interest you, check out the description where you can find out how to support the channel using one of those methods. First up, there's Altenac the Thrice Called, which for 5 generic and 2 green is a 9/9 legendary insect beast and uncommon. It's got trample, and when it becomes a target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you draw a card. You can also pay 1 generic and a green and discard Altenac to return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This is a huge body that will dominate most boards, and your opponent can never kill it without giving you a 2-for-1. That said, it can still hurt to spend 7 on something and have your opponent kill it for 2 mana, even when you get that 2-for-1. It's a real pity Altenac doesn't also gain you life or something, as that would make a big difference. But Altenac's ability to ramp your mana if you have lands in your graveyard is pretty useful, especially if you've got some way to bring it back later. And that is doable in the format, especially if black is your second color. There's also a card in the set that has an effect related to Altenac that we'll see later. I'm giving this card a C+. Next up, it's Anthropede, which for 3 generic and a green is a 3/4 insect at common. It's got reach. When it enters, you may discard a card or pay 2 generic. When you do, destroy target room. So this set has a lot of rooms, but a lot of them generate value when they get unlocked. So destroying one by paying this extra kicker of 2 generic or discarding a card just isn't always going to be useful, and you have a below rate creature too. I'm giving this a D+. Next up, it's Balustrade Worm, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 5/5 worm at rare. It can't be countered, it has trample and haste, and it also has Delirium, which means if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, you get something extra. In this case, it gains the activated ability 2 generic and 2 green, return Balustrade Worm from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. A 5-mana 5/5 with trample and haste is a very real beating that can win the game quickly in many situations. It's probably about a B, and this can come back from the graveyard once, and that's definitely a 2-for-1, and I think bringing it back in the later game is going to be easy, and it's certainly still going to be relevant. I'm giving this an A-. Next up, it's Bashful Beastie, which for 4 generic and a green is a 5/4 beast at common. When it dies, you manifest Dread. This means you look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one onto the battlefield face down as a 2/2 creature and the other into your graveyard. You turn it face up at any time for its mana cost if it's a creature card. A 5-mana 5/4 that dies into a 2/2 token would be a solid card, and this 2/2 is better than a token in most respects. This looks like a good common. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Break Down the Door, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon instant. It says choose one, exile target artifact, exile target enchantment, or manifest Dread. This is definitely a main deck card in the format, because there are lots of artifacts and enchantments, including mini creatures, and the fill case is still an instant speed 2/2 with upside. I could even see this ending up with a premium removal type grade by the end of the format, but for now I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Cathartic Parting, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery that says the owner of target artifact or enchantment an opponent controls shuffles it into their library. You may shuffle up to 4 target cards from your graveyard into your library. This is another card that I think will have enough targets in the format to be a main deck card. The shuffle part isn't the most exciting, but it does keep your opponent from potentially getting Delirium when you shuffle their thing into their deck, and shuffling your own cards back into your deck certainly isn't a bad thing. Overall though, I think this is another spell that in most formats would be a sideboard card, but in this one, I think it's a pretty nice main deck card. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Cautious Survivor, which for 3 generic and a green is a 4/4 Elf Survivor at common. It's got Survival, and that means if it's tapped at the beginning of your second main phase, you get something. In this case, you gain 2 life. A 4-mana 4/4 is right on rate, but this ability is nothing special. Sometimes it'll feel like half lifelink, I guess. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Coordinated Clobbering, which for 1 green mana is an uncommon sorcery. Tap 1 or 2 target untapped creatures you control. They each deal damage equal to their power to target creature an opponent controls. This looks really good. It would be good in any set, since it's a 1 mana removal spell that does the job more often than not. But the tapping can be big upside in this format because it can help you trigger Survival. And if it's a good Survival trigger, it's going to feel like you're getting a 2-for-1. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Cryptid Inspector, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/3 Elf Warrior at common. It's got Vigilance. Whenever a face-down permanent you control enters, and whenever Cryptid Inspector or another target permanent you control is turned face up, put a +1/+1 counter on Cryptid Inspector. The baseline here isn't great, but putting counters on a Vigilance creature is pretty sweet. And even if you just get 1 counter on this thing, it's going to feel good. And you can just Manifest Dread this and then turn it face up and have it be a 4/3. And then it gets bonuses from, everything else that happens Manifest Dread-wise. And most green decks are going to have several cards with Manifest Dread, especially blue-green, which is a Manifest Dread deck. But like I said, you really only need 1 counter for this to feel good. Looks pretty nice to me, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Defiant Survivor, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/2 human survivor at uncommon. It's got Survival, Manifest, Dread. This is a strong survival trigger. I mean, making a 2/2 every turn, if that's what this card did, would be completely insane. They did have to balance that fact by giving it a below-rate stat line, and one that means it's pretty hard for it to survive an attack. But if you can back this thing up with combat tricks, it's going to be completely back-breaking. You basically get the card back from the combat trick and killed your opponent's creature. The question is, how easy will that be to do? There are other creative ways to tap creatures in the format. We've seen those. I mean, I just think overall, green decks are going to be able to trigger this often enough for this to be pretty good. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Enduring Vitality, which for 1 generic and 2 green is a 3/3 enchantment creature Elk Glimmer at rare. It's got Vigilance, and creatures you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color. When it dies, if it was a creature, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. It's an enchantment. So even if this didn't come back as a non-creature enchantment, it would be a pretty good card. It has good stats and nicely ramps and fixes your mana. When you play it on 3, there's a pretty decent chance you untap on your next turn and play something way ahead of schedule. It does get less good the longer the game goes on in most ways because you just don't have that much to spend mana on, although in this format you do have mana to spend on turning things face up and stuff. And you're going to end up holding on to that ability, which again does usually stop being useful at some point in the game, but you have like a really good baseline and a really high ceiling, giving this a B+. Next up, it's Fear of Exposure, which for 2 generic and a green is a 5/4 enchantment creature Nightmare at uncommon. As an additional cost to cast this spell, tap 2 untapped creatures and or lands you control. We saw a card a lot like this in the Brothers War that really overperformed, and this is better in most ways. For one thing, Fear of Exposure is even bigger and comes with Trample. Now, the other card I'm talking about could also let you tap artifacts, but I think this makes up for not doing that by being an enchantment, and this being a set where tapping your own creatures can come with some pretty legit value. The worst case scenario is that you spend 5 mana on a 5/4 Trampler, and while that's not ideal, that's the worst this will be, and it'll often be better. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Flesh Burrower, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 insect at common. It's got Death Touch. Whenever it attacks, another target creature you control gains Death Touch until end of turn. A 2-drop that can trade for anything is fine. In the early game, it can make your attacks a lot better by giving Death Touch to other stuff too. And it can usually attack on just about any board because of Death Touch, and that means you're also going to be giving something else Death Touch pretty often. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Frantic Strength, which for 2 generic and a green is a common enchantment aura with flash and enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and has trample. If this were a straight up trick, it wouldn't be that good. It's too much mana for the bonus. But anytime you put a bonus like this on an aura, it does make a difference because it sticks around even after your creature wins combat, and trample can sometimes help you win out of nowhere. It also happens to trigger Eerie at instant speed, which is definitely relevant. Still, it's a situational enough card that I don't see myself playing it a ton, especially because it costs 3 mana. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Grasping Longneck, which for 2 generic and a green is a 4/2 enchantment creature horror at common. It's got reach, and when it dies, you gain 2 life. 3 mana 4/2s are often kind of miserable because they die to such cheap removal and can't block and survive being attacked by some 1-drops. But the long neck at least gives you a bit of value when that happens, and the enchantment typing is important too, giving it a C. Next up, it's Greenhouse and Rickety Gazebo. This is an enchantment room at uncommon. This is a new enchantment subtype. You can cast either half when it's in your hand, and that door unlocks on the battlefield. As a sorcery, you can pay the mana cost of a locked door to unlock it. The Greenhouse side is 2 generic and a green, and it says lands you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color. And the Rickety Gazebo side is 3 generic and a green, and it says when you unlock this door, mill 4 cards and return up to 2 permanent cards from among them to your hand. This doesn't look great for limited. Neither effect impacts the board, and the Greenhouse side is particularly underwhelming. It just doesn't give you an effect that is all that relevant in most limited games. The Gazebo is a 4 mana draw 2 that does give you a couple of cards, provided you milled a couple of permanents. Can help you get Delirium and stuff like that, but that's not amazing either. There are better Delirium enablers out there that do add to the board. I'm giving this a D. Next up, it's Hauntwood's Shrieker, which for 1 generic and 2 green is a 3/3 Beast Mutant at Mythic Rare. When it attacks, you manifest Dread, and you can pay 1 generic and a green and reveal target face down permanent. If it's a creature card, you may turn it face up. This is an amazing attack trigger. You know, a minute ago I said, imagine that this makes a manifest Dread every turn about a survival creature that was a 3 mana 3/2. Well, Hauntwood Shrieker gets closer to it because it doesn't even have to survive. As long as you're trading with it when you attack, you end up getting a 2-for-1 plus some extra value. There will be times where it can't really attack because there are bigger creatures around and stuff like that. But it is nice. You can look at other face down stuff, which you're likely to have. It also gives you more information about your opponent's stuff. Obviously, if that's all it had going on, it wouldn't be very good. But you can also turn your stuff face up for only 2 mana, which at times will just be completely absurd. So it has this really good baseline where it's just a value engine for Manifest Dread. And if you can't attack with it, it still has a useful ability. I think it's a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Hedge Shredder, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a 5/5 vehicle at rare. When it attacks, you may mill 2 cards, and whenever 1 or more lands are put into your graveyard from your library, put them onto the battlefield tapped, and it has Crew 1. A 4 mana 5/5 vehicle with Crew 1 is okay, especially when it also loads your graveyard and gives you some lands. Crewing vehicles has extra value in the format too because of survival, giving this a B. Next up, it's Horrid Vigor, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant. Target creature gains Death Touch and indestructible until end of turn. This will win just about any combat and blanks most removal too. This is going to work pretty well with survival creatures, for example, because it just lets your survival creature, survive. And when it's a trigger, like one that gives you a manifest, you're coming out way ahead when you do that. Still, it's probably just a C. Next up, it's House Cartographer, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 Human Scout Survivor at uncommon. It has Survival. Reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a land card. Put that card into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This is a pretty nice survival trigger. It draws you a card when it survives. It, of course, always has to be a land, but a card's a card, and this can help you fix your mana to some extent. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Insidious Fungus, which for 1 green is a 1/2 creature fungus at uncommon. You can pay 2 generic and sacrifice it, and then you choose one. Destroy target artifact, destroy target enchantment, draw a card, then you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. A 1 mana 1/2 becomes irrelevant pretty quickly, but this offers some nice utility, and the third mode will pretty much always be useful, and if you have targets for the other 2 modes, it'll feel pretty good. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Kona Rescue Beastie, which for 3 generic and a green is a 4/3 legendary beast survivor at rare. It has Survival. You may put a permanent card from your hand onto the battlefield. This kind of card always gets people excited, but it never performs well in limited. You often have nothing to put into play, and if you do, it's not significant enough to make a difference. Remember, this kind of card doesn't give you card advantage, it just gives you a discount, which is substantially weaker in limited. Especially because it's not like you're always getting that discount. You do have to have a permanent that you can put into play, which is far from guaranteed. 9 times out of 10, this is just going to be a 4 mana 4/3, and a 4 mana 4/3 is like a D. I do think it'll let you put something into play, like, even if what happens is you put a 2-drop into play that you didn't have mana for, that ends up working okay. It doesn't feel amazing, but I do think you'll put something into play often enough for it to be a C. Next up, it's Leyline of Mutation, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a rare enchantment. If it's in your opening hand, you can begin the game with it on the battlefield, and you can pay white, blue, black, red, green, rather than pay the mana cost for spells that you cast. Like all the other Leylines, this is awful in Limited. You use up a card to add an alternate cost that you'll absolutely never be able to pay. It's an F. Next up, it's Manifest Dread, which for 1 generic and a green is a common sorcery that says, Manifest Dread. I think 2 mana for this effect is right on rate. You get a 2/2 with upside and throw a couple of cards in the graveyard, counting the sorcery itself. There's value in both of those things in green, giving this a C. Next up, it's Moldering Gym and Weight Room. This is another enchantment room. This one's a common. You can pay 2 generic and a green for Moldering Gym. When you unlock this door, search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. And Weight Room is 5 generic and a green. When you unlock this door, Manifest Dread, then put 3 +1/+1 counters on that creature. 3 mana, it's a rampant growth. Hasn't played well in Limited for a while, because, you're not adding to the board, unless you get something else from the effect. And while you do eventually with Weight Room, I think it happens too late for you to be pumped about that. Even with the land you grab, it's going to be a while before this room does something on board. And while what you get in the end is a fairly beefy manifest that you're only overpaying for by a little bit, it's too slow for me to be excited about. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Monstrous Emergence, which for 1 generic and a green is a common sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, choose a creature you control or reveal a creature card from your hand. Monstrous Emergence deals damage equal to the power of the creature you chose or the card you revealed to target creature. This is very, very good. It's a way better version of Rabid Bite. One of the big problems that this type of removal has is that if you don't have a creature in play, it may as well be blank, or if you have too small of a creature in play, it doesn't do anything. This helps you get around that by letting you reveal a creature from your hand too, and that's perfect because by the later stages of the game, when you don't have a creature in your hand, you'll have creatures in play who can use it the best. Also, even when you do go with a creature in play, you don't risk a 2-for-1 since choosing the creature is part of the cost. The emergence will still do damage to the other creature equal to the creature's power before it died. There's no way for your opponent to interact with that. At least not by removing your creature. That's not going to stop this from doing damage. So yeah, this solves most of the problems this type of removal usually has. And keep in mind, Rabid Bite-like effects are already pretty darn good. I think this is a B. Next up, it's Omnivorous Flytrap, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/4 plant at rare. It's got Delirium. When it enters or attacks, if there are 4 more card types among cards in your graveyard, distribute 2 +1/+1 counters among 1 or 2 target creatures. Then if there are 6 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, double the number of +1/+1 counters on those creatures. This can get out of control in a hurry if you have Delirium. 2 +1/+1 counters on enter and attacks is going to make combat very difficult on your opponent, and sometimes you'll get even more than that, and you're only paying 3 mana once to get all of that. This delivers so much value for the cost. You're not always going to have Delirium on turn 3. In fact, it'll probably be pretty rare that you do, but even if you play this on 4 or 5, it's going to be able to snowball and take over some games. I'm giving this a B+. Next up, it's Overgrown Zealot, which for 1 generic and a green is a 0/4 Elf Druid at uncommon. It can tap for 1 mana of any color, or 2 mana of any one color. Spend this mana only to turn permanents face up. A 2 mana 0/4 is bad, but tapping for mana of any color is good, especially when you can tap for even more mana for your manifested creatures. It is a bit of a bummer that it's such a mediocre draw in the mid to late game, though. They've been giving us mana dorks recently that have some sort of utility even in the late game. This one doesn't. It's almost like you're just drawing a land that can chump block in the late game, and that feels pretty bad, though it is still better than a land, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Overlord of the Hauntwoods, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 6/5 enchantment creature avatar horror at Mythic Rare. It's got impending 4, and you pay 1 generic and 2 green. That's an alternate casting cost, and if you cast it that way, it enters with 4 time counters and isn't a creature until the last is removed. At the beginning of your end step, remove a time counter from it, and when Overlord of the Hauntwoods enters or attacks, create a tapped colorless land token named Everywhere that is every basic land type. So if you've seen the other videos, I gave every one of the other Overlords at least an A-. This one's pretty underwhelming compared to its brethren. That's because its trigger just isn't that exciting. Its trigger doesn't add to the board in any real sort of way. It does ramp your mana, it does fix your mana, but these aren't things that are super valuable and limited. You know, the other Overlords like net you a card in a much realer fashion by drawing you cards, getting cards back from the graveyard, killing a creature, making creature tokens. This one just gives you this land thing, and that means the ability also doesn't add to the board at all, which is dangerous on turn 3 if you do actually impend it. This might just be one that you just want to cast most of the time, unless you really need the mana and the fixing, because once you're playing it as a 5 mana 6/5 that gives you that, it feels a lot better. But this definitely isn't a bomb, and I don't even think it's all that close. It's a good card, but it's definitely way less impressive than its brethren, at least in limited. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Patchwork Beastie, which for 1 green mana is a 3/3 artifact creature beast at uncommon. It has Delirium. It can't attack or block unless there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you may mill a card. So you do get a way above rate body, but it does take a bit of work to get it going. It's basically non-existent until you get Delirium, other than its ability. The good news is it helps you with some of that work. This is something you can play on turn 1 that is going to mill a card every turn and ultimately will get you Delirium. By the time it can attack and block, it's not nearly as impressive, but the fact that it's an enabler and a good Delirium enabler, one that gets going early, certainly makes it a card that you're going to want, especially in the graveyard decks like black-green and red-green. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Rootwise Survivor, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 3/4 human survivor at uncommon. It's got haste and survival. Put 3 +1/+1 counters and up to 1 target land you control. That land becomes a 0/0 elemental creature in addition to its other types. It gains haste until your next turn. That last part sounds kind of silly, but they did it to avoid feel-bads, because if you do make your land into a creature and it doesn't have haste, you can't tap it for mana. So that's why that's there. You're never going to be able to attack with the creature the turn you animate it because of how survival works. Having haste on a survival creature is pretty cool because it makes it more likely you can get in for an attack with this and get the survival trigger. And the survival trigger is a pretty good one. That said, there are going to be plenty of times where, you can't attack with this right away. It's not like a 3/4 on 5 is going to be anywhere close to the most imposing presence on the board. So I think this is one, sometimes you'll be able to sneak it in, and when you do that, it'll feel pretty good, but most of the time, you're going to be reliant on tapping it. And in the meantime, you have a significantly understated creature. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Say Its Name, which for 1 generic and a green is a common sorcery. Mill 3 cards, then you may return a creature or land card from your graveyard to your hand. Exile this card and 2 other cards named Say Its Name from your graveyard. Search your graveyard, hand, and or library for a card named Altenac, the Thrice Called, this was the card I was talking about earlier, and put it onto the battlefield. If you search your library this way, shuffle, activate only as a sorcery. So let's put the Altenac aside for now. How good is 1 generic and a green, mill 3 cards, return a creature or land card from your graveyard to your hand? Pretty good in this format, I think. Unlike a lot of these effects we've seen lately, it doesn't only let you get cards from the ones you milled either. You have access to your entire graveyard when you cast this. And it's also a really good Delirium enabler, obviously enough. And I think if you end up picking up an Altenac, playing 3 or 4 Say Its Names in your Delirium deck makes a ton of sense. I mean, you get to put it directly onto the battlefield. I mean, I wouldn't count on doing this all the time. You have to end up with 3 Say Its Names in your graveyard. It is a common, but like I just said, it's also one that I think black-green and red-green are equally going to be interested in, and maybe even some other decks. So it's not like no one's going to want this, because it's pretty good without the Altenac upside, but you're always going to play Altenac anyway as well. So it doesn't really cost you anything to do this. Looks pretty solid to me, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Slavering Branch Snapper, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 7/6 lizard at common. It's got trample and forest cycling for 2 generic. It's a strictly better Colossal Dreadmaw, but a big French vanilla creature isn't exactly something to get excited about these days. Sure, if your opponent is defenseless, it can take over the game, but that's just not how Magic plays out most of the time. This isn't bad, just not especially good either, though it does of course help itself out by having forest cycling, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Spine Seeker Centipede, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/1 insect at common. When it enters, you search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. And it has Delirium. It gets +1/+2 and Vigilance. So, creatures that search up land on ETB always tend to perform well. This is because they're 2-for-1s, and 2-for-1s that have the potential to even fix your mana. Furthermore, this one actually becomes kind of a legit threat by the mid to late game. This looks like a very good common. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Threats Around Every Corner, which for 3 generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment. When it enters, you manifest Dread. Whenever a face-down permanent you control enters, search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. I think this looks really good. You get a lot for the cost. You get 3 pieces of material. You get the enchantment itself, which can trigger Eerie. You get the manifested creature, which also helps you load the graveyard. And you get a land. That's pretty good value for 4 mana. You can kind of look at this as a 4 mana 2/2 that does all this stuff. And when you look at it that way, it seems even better. I think this looks really strong, and it even gets you more lands with more face-down permanents around, giving it a B. Next up, it's Twitching Doll, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 artifact creature spider toy at rare. It can tap for 1 mana of any color. You put a nest counter on Twitching Doll, and you can also tap and sacrifice the doll to create a 2/2 green spider creature token with reach for each counter on Twitching Doll. Activate only as a sorcery. A 2 mana 2/2 that taps for mana of any color is pretty great and limited, and this has the upside of turning into a bunch of spiders in the late game. Even on a stalled out board, you can just keep tapping it for the counters and eventually go super wide. This looks really good. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Tyvar the Pummeler, which for 1 generic and 2 green is a 3/3 legendary elf warrior. At Mythic Rare, you can tap another untapped creature you control, and Tyvar gains indestructible until end of turn. Tap it. You can pay 3 generic and 2 green, and creatures you control get +X until end of turn, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Playing against Tyvar is going to be really frustrating. He's a great attacker because he can become indestructible, and if he sticks around long enough, he can use his activated ability to turn most boards lethal. Furthermore, tapping down your creatures, of course, has extra format-specific synergy because of survival. One thing I always like to remind people about with this type of indestructible ability is that tapping it is not part of the cost. This means Tyvar can attack and still become indestructible even if he's already tapped, because it's part of the effect, not part of the cost. Tyvar seems incredibly strong between being difficult to deal with, being reasonably efficient, and having a game-winning activated ability. You do need to have a creature in play, but I don't think that's a crazy ask on most board states. I think he's a bomb. I'm giving him an A. Next up, it's Under the Skin, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery. Manifest Dread. You may return a permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. A 3 mana 2/2 that returns a permanent from your graveyard to your hand is good, especially because Manifest Dread can let you put that permanent into your graveyard in the first place. This means this is kind of like a 3 mana 2/2 that draws you a card, with more upside than that since it can get permanents other than the one you mill, and your 2/2 might become a scary creature later. There's a chance you don't put a permanent into your graveyard, but worth remembering that Under the Skin doesn't have to be self-contained like that, it just can be. So this looks pretty good to me. It looks like it's a 2-for-1 in a lot of situations. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Valgavoth's Onslaught, which for X green is a rare sorcery. Manifest Dread X times, then put X +1/+1 counters on each of those creatures. No matter what you pay for X here, you get a very nice return on your investment. 1 for X gives you a 3/3 with upside for 3. 2 for X gives you 2 4/4s for 5, and so on. I think this is just a bomb, as casting it for 5 is enough to win most games, and it scales from there. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Walk-In Closet and Forgotten Cellar, a mythic rare enchantment room. The Walk-In Closet side is 2 generic and a green. You may play lands from your graveyard. The Forgotten Cellar side is 3 generic and 2 green, and when you unlock it, you can cast spells from your graveyard this turn, and if a card would be put into your graveyard from anywhere this turn, exile it instead. This looks awful and limited. Playing lands from the yard isn't relevant 99.9% of the time, and Forgotten Cellar costing 5 to unlock means it's highly unlikely to allow you to do anything else that turn. This is just an F. You have 2 sides that effectively do nothing in limited. Next up, it's Wary Watchdog, which for 1 generic and a green is a 3/1 dog at common. When it enters or dies, you surveil 1. 2 surveils is pretty nice value to staple to a 2 mana 3/1. It can potentially get you 3/4 of the way to Delirium, all on its own. We saw pretty much the same card in March of the Machine, and it was solid. I'm giving this a C. And our last card is Wickerfolk Thresher, which for 3 generic and a green is a 5/4 artifact creature Scarecrow at uncommon, and it has Delirium. When it attacks, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land, you may put it onto the battlefield. If you don't put the card onto the battlefield, put it into your hand. I don't love having to jump through 2 hoops to get those trigger, those hoops being Delirium and attacking, but they are pretty jumpable hoops for green, and this has a nice stat line. If you can attack with it once, you get a 2-for-1, and it's also nice that it's an artifact creature, which allows you to enable Delirium, and it does have the potential to really snowball. I'm giving this a B. So now we've covered every single card in the play boosters for this set. But I'm not done making Duskmourn House of Horror limited content. I've got my archetype guide coming out next. Also have a top 10 on the biggest bombs in the format, a video where I break down the best commons and uncommons in the format, draft videos, and lots of future discussion of this format. So if you want to catch any of that, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to make sure you're caught up on the set review, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.